We had a very good outcome with the Houthis, and we honor their word. I mean, they made a commitment, and we dealt with other countries that were close to them and their surrogates, and we honor all of their words. We'll see what happens, but I think, I believe that hopefully that's over with, and they'll leave the ships alone, just leave those ships alone. But so we do. We take their word for it. It was, we hit them very hard. They had a great capacity to withstand punishment. They took tremendous punishment, and you could say there's a lot of bravery there. It was amazing what they took. But we honor their commitment and their word. They gave us their word that they wouldn't be shooting ships anymore, and we honor that.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I am here as always with our lovely producer, M. Siniza. We are recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying but so far from dead. For 12 years, Saudi Arabia has imposed a devastating siege on its southern neighbor Yemen in an attempt to dislodge the Ansarallah movement from its position of power in Sana'a. From 2015 to 2022, the campaign was an active war, as a coalition of Gulf states, with backing from the US and the UK, carried out over 25,000 air raids on the country. The war and blockade helped produce one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world. But the campaign failed, and by now, after years of Saudi and American attempts to defeat Ansarallah, the balance of power has changed quite dramatically. By this summer, the uneasy truce that had largely frozen the front line since 2022 was already beginning to fray. Saudi-backed forces inside Yemen had been reorganizing and redeploying for months, including around Marib and along the Western Front. And by July, forces were amassing along a front stretching from the Red Sea toward the Saudi border. For Ansarallah, these movements increasingly looked like preparations for a renewed offensive. It was against this backdrop that last month, an Iranian flight carrying a senior Ansarallah delegation attempted to land at Sana'a International Airport, without first seeking Saudi approval. For Ansarallah, the issue was straightforward. Why should Yemen require permission from Saudi Arabia to land an airplane in its own capital? What happened next was a series of escalatory moves that bring us to the present. First, the Saudi-backed forces on July 13th bombed the runway at Sana'a Airport in an attempt to prevent the Iranian flight from landing. Ansarallah responded almost immediately by striking Abha Airport in southwestern Saudi Arabia, targeting Saudi oil infrastructure, including refineries of the state-owned Aramco oil company, and announcing what it described as a blockade on Saudi shipping through the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia then retaliated with strikes on Hodeidah and Kamaran Island, and continued its supply of allied forces along Yemen's front lines, in apparent preparation for a new ground offensive. Next, Ansarallah launched a preemptive attack on those forces, firing dozens of missiles and drones against the Saudi-backed military camps in central and southern Yemen, reportedly killing dozens, while also striking the strategic port city of Mocha near the Bab al-Mandab Strait. The confrontation threatens to overturn the uneasy truce that has largely frozen the Saudi-Yemen war since April 2022. But Ansarallah is returning to that confrontation from a radically different position. Over the past several years, the movement has demonstrated an ability to strike Israel with ballistic missiles, disrupt commercial shipping through the Red Sea, withstand American and Israeli bombardment, and threaten critical infrastructure throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Now, as the US-Israeli war on Iran transforms the regional balance of power, Yemen is once again emerging as one of its decisive fronts. Ansarallah has framed the renewed confrontation not simply as an extension of the Iran war, but as a continuation of Yemen's own unfinished war, a struggle for control over not just Yemeni airspace and ports, but ultimately the country's sovereignty. A coalition that entered Yemen more than a decade ago, expecting to rapidly defeat Ansarallah, now faces a Yemeni movement capable of imposing substantial costs on Saudi Arabia itself. The blockade once imposed upon Yemen has given rise to what Ansarallah calls a strategy of siege for siege. If Yemen's access to the world can be controlled from outside its borders, then the movement intends to demonstrate that Saudi Arabia's access to the world economy can be made vulnerable as well. To understand how Yemen arrived at this moment, and why a country so often represented in the West as little more than the site of an Iranian proxy war has instead become one of the most consequential sites of resistance to the regional order, we are joined today by Issa Blumi. Issa Blumi is a professor at Stockholm University in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and the author of Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. But before we turn to the conversation, a note to our listeners. If you want more Turbulence, our paid feed is only $5 a month and includes weekly bonus episodes where we break down the week's news, go deeper on topics covered in our interviews, and publish extended conversations with guests. Turbulence is independent, ad-free, and entirely supported by our listeners. We can't make this show without you, as your subscriptions allow us to keep producing politically independent work week after week. And to those already contributing, thank you. Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Issa Blumi, a professor at Stockholm University in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He is the author of Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. Professor Blumi, thank you for joining us at Turbulence.
It's a great pleasure, despite the fact that turbulence is the wrong reason for people meeting across geographies and time. But it's my pleasure to be part of your program.
We very much appreciate your time. So I'm going to start by timestamping this recording because the developments are moving quickly in Saudi Arabia. We are recording this on the morning East Coast time of Sunday, August 9th. I'd like to start by asking you to assess the situation as it stands. In just the past week, we've witnessed a pretty remarkable military operation from Ansarallah. Using a large number of missiles and drones, they preemptively struck Saudi-backed forces that were staging an offensive in Marib that reportedly killed dozens of combatants. It was a quite devastating attack and took many by surprise. And now, just a couple of hours ago, they announced another attack on a similar mobilization in the Al-Mokha area near the al-Mandab Strait. What are these Saudi-backed forces planning, and how did Ansarallah achieve the kind of intelligence infiltration necessary for these preemptive strikes?
Right. So Saudi Arabia, since June, indeed, has been trying to mobilize their auxiliary forces, mostly local and foreign and recruited mercenaries who periodically front immediate Saudi interests in protecting oil infrastructure, in especially the area of Marib that you mentioned, as well as Shabwa, which is a little bit to the south of Marib. Yemen's currently developed oil and gas infrastructure and considerable amounts of money that comes out of the region helps give us a kind of precursor to the rationale for why Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar have put so much efforts over the last 10 plus years to subordinate, subjugate, if necessary, destroy what was a unified Yemeni state before that. And the preemption that we call it is in fact a response to, one, this aggressive mobilization in June, which corresponded with the return to belligerent, violent actions in the larger region, especially vis-a-vis Iran, attacks on Iraqi elements that were close to and had long worked with Iran to help bring stability to the Iraqi state. And, of course, the events in the Levant, with South Lebanon being the principal target for a structured campaign of elimination. So why Saudi Arabia had been commanded to initiate and alert Ansarallah, which had been, with some short-term attempts at addressing Israeli-American aggression towards Ansarallah throughout the previous 6 months, firing ballistic missiles and initiating through drones some kind of contact, especially with Israeli forces. There was no reason for Saudi Arabia to engage Ansarallah, to stick, again, a finger into the beehive of Ansarallah, which has regularly demonstrated an ability to not only undermine any regional campaign to subordinate 21 million Yemenis, the very fact that the Americans themselves fundamentally failed in their campaigns to end Ansarallah's administration of northern Yemen during the Ansarallah's efforts to respond to events in Gaza from 2023 onwards, alerts us to, again, the capacity of Ansarallah on the ground, using indigenous engineering, its manufacturing capability to produce large numbers of relatively cheap but very effective ballistic missiles and drones, makes for the adventurism of Saudi Arabia in early June an interesting point of departure for larger conversation, if you will. But I will answer the second part. Yes, so the continuation of this project. Clearly, Ansarallah's intelligence, which they have plenty of informants on the ground throughout southern Yemen, areas that they don't have any administrative responsibilities, nevertheless, they have sympathizers and large human resources to observe what's going on, let alone drones, which can take the shape and size of small paper airplanes, right, these days. So they know what's going on in these camps. They can observe from afar large equipment movement, which is one of the things that alerted Ansarallah in June. And the preemption is hitting concentrations of these forces that were otherwise dispersed or based elsewhere, and they started to concentrate in areas that seemingly the Americans, Israelis, who are behind the scenes initiating Saudi Arabia's investment in new direct conflict with Ansarallah, felt was areas of weakness or wanted to initiate what is now happening. So why engage and invite Ansarallah to actually take defensive measures is one thing. But I think by way of a pattern that Ansarallah has adopted, sometimes very frustrating to myself, considering their adversaries are ruthless and have no interest in a peaceable kind of coexistence. This is an ongoing project to destroy Ansarallah's administration of the vast majority of Yemenis who live in this isolated zone of besiegement. They've been under siege since March of 2015, and that has not been in any ways a condition of it that has seen improvement, despite periodic ceasefires and temporary, let's say, ending of direct conflict. The people have suffered mightily over these 10 plus years. And yet they regularly restrain themselves from actually initiating conflict themselves. And that, I could suggest, maybe in subsequent follow-up, can reflect some limitations that Ansarallah has, and we can itemize and list what they are. But for now, their aggressive anticipation and initiation of direct conflict acknowledges, one, that Saudi Arabia and its assets were mobilizing to wage a ground offensive in tandem with the continuous air campaigns that have been going on. The fact that it's expanded not only to hit infrastructure in areas what would be still considered territorially Yemen, but the economic assets of Saudi Arabia in neighboring territories, Jazan and the larger Asir region, Najran, and you mentioned the attacks in Mukha on the southwest coast, which had been in 2018 captured by mostly UAE-funded forces at that time, and has remained outside the access of the 21 plus million people who live under Ansarallah's administration. Those attacks also signal that there have been large concentrations, recent concentrations of ammunition, of extra forces, and that they were also attacked this morning, along with Jubail, which is a big infrastructure complex in the northeast of Saudi Arabia, closer to the borders with Iraq and the Gulf, suggests that the territorial range, if you will, of this uptake in violence between Ansarallah and Saudi Arabia and its allies will increasingly expand deep inside Saudi territory, which is one of the primary weaknesses we would think of Mohammed bin Salman's regime. And the vulnerability of seeing their infrastructure destroyed makes sense as a tactic. But there also, I would suggest there's something else afoot that we may want to talk about at some point. So the assets that are being destroyed in Saudi Arabia right now may not necessarily be a game changer in ending Saudi Arabia's adventurism at this stage.
Yeah, so I'd like to go further on why we are seeing this escalation now. I mean, you mentioned that Ansarallah is, essentially responding to these mobilizations, but I think it's worth noting that we're in the 6th month of the US-Israeli war on Iran, and we're nearing 3 years since October 7th. And, both of these are different kind of timescales of the broader regional war that has engulfed the region for quite a while. And in both of those broader conflicts, Ansarallah has been a major player within the broader so-called axis of resistance in terms of firing ballistic missiles at Israel in solidarity with Gaza, also facing down the US military in the Gulf of Aden, and then, of course, participating in more broadly in defense of Iran since the onset of this war 6 months ago. But the other way to view this, of course, right, is in the context of their own struggle with Saudi Arabia and Saudi's incursion onto Yemeni sovereignty. So I guess my question is, why did the Saudi-Yemen conflict not open up until now? And then why, I think a lot of us were, observing the initial act that catalyzed this escalatory sequence, which was the Saudi airstrikes on the airport in Sana'a.
Yemen's legitimate government, with the help of the international community, has tried on so many occasions through diplomacy and other legal means to convince the Iranian regime and the Houthis in Sana'a to correct course and come back into the international fold. We called on them not to breach Yemen's airspace. This is not the first breach, but this time was different as it challenged the legitimacy of all internationally recognized laws. And now we tell them that our patience has run out and we will respond to the breach with adequate means to confront the plane violating our airspace.
Purportedly to prevent an IRGC or a US-sanctioned airplane from landing. It didn't really seem like their airstrikes did very much, and that seemed to catalyze the sequence, with Ansarallah then responding by striking Aramco refineries, etc. And I think a lot of us were wondering, what was Saudi doing? Why start this escalatory sequence now? And do you view that as part of the broader strategic logic of the US-Israel aligned forces in the battle against Iran? Or is this more an evolution of, or an opportunity for Saudi incursion in the broader Saudi-Yemen conflict? Or is it something like both?
Right. So again, the time sequence of this latest, if you want to call it escalation, again, begins with the mobilization of auxiliary forces inside Yemeni territories. Then the funeral in Iran, where dignitaries who would attend it, as well as people who were being treated for health reasons over the years, were being flown back by Iranian airlines on several occasions. So the sequence is actually already a mobilization of ground forces and indicating that there is something afoot coming from Saudi Arabia. So what is behind all this? I want to highlight again that the connections between Iran and Yemen may be, at least rhetorically, in solidarity, but in practicality, they are very different stories and different phases or aspects of this larger confrontation of Euro-American imperialism by way of its colonial enterprise in Palestine, by way of its surrogate states in the Gulf. And throughout this, what we would call the Ramadan period of war with Iran, Yemeni Ansarallah has remained largely out of it. They have not articulated beyond a rhetorical position in general that what attacks and what confronts Iran is something that is a global problem. But they say this about what's happening in Latin America and Cuba as well, right? So they are able to articulate and position Yemeni confrontation with empire in a global framework, in which the war on Iran is one of them. Now, I also, and I've regularly mentioned, that we must also acknowledge that inside Iran itself, there has been considerable tensions over how to pursue long-term and medium-term a relationship with the larger world, with those liberals wishing for rehabilitating Iran and somehow trying to find a way to actually make amends and be reintegrated into the global economy, a very potentially very profitable enterprise for those who would be the beneficiaries of that. Now that, I think, reflects in some ways a tension between, therefore, the foreign ministry and elements who may be taking over some portfolios in Iran's historic relationship with Yemen, with Syria, with Lebanon. And Ansarallah, I think, are very skeptical about some of these actors. They may not know to what extent they can actually trust certain elements who are making their now presence in these interactions that take place, whether it be in Karbala, in Iran itself, in other settings throughout the world. So Ansarallah, I think, is very much on its own. It has its own domestic calculations at play. Not in a cynical sense that they're only doing things, as often scholars of this cohort of Yemeni studies like to argue on behalf of their paymasters in the think tank universe there in Washington, New York, and London. They are not simple puppets of Iran. They are not, if that is indeed a concession we're willing to make, which I think more and more people are willing to make that they have their own objectives and concerns. They are also not cynically using the story, the horrors of Gaza or larger Palestine as a cause célèbre to justify how they administer a region under besiegement for over 10 years. No, this is a very progressive, broad alliance of Yemeni actors who often come from very different backgrounds, different sectarian associations, different socioeconomic backgrounds, levels of education, and collectively they represent a remarkable iteration of nationalism as Yemenis and solidarity in the larger global sense with peoples who have faced similar kinds of challenges and threats, murderous campaigns against the peoples who are of tradition, who have embraced a different approach to managing their lives through their cultural as well as methods of economic production. So Ansarallah's principled challenge to Israel, United States in the Red Sea, one that has been largely distorted by, I'm afraid, even those who are sympathetic to Yemenis by way of their solidarity for Iran, by misrepresenting it as a collective blockade of commercial shipping in the Red Sea. No, it was specifically addressing and attending to ships that supplied Israel. Other commercial ships could have flowed freely through the Red Sea. It was the coalition that was waging a war against Ansarallah, using as a pretext the free flow of commerce in the Red Sea, that actually stopped shipping, because the moment bombs are flying and anti-ships missiles are flying from the Yemeni coastline, blowing up American aircraft carriers or damaging them, insurance costs make it prohibitively expensive for the shipping companies. They made the decision to go around Africa instead.
Right.
And the similar kinds of dynamics are at play with the Straits of Hormuz. Now, Ansarallah is not part of the larger economics of this very lucrative phase, if you will, of imperialism, the financialization of the waves of ceasefire, the waves of panic, the exploitation of a discourse about the severity of supply chain disruptions. You have a lot of players in the immediate Trump administration environments, in Washington, in Wall Street, no doubt in Tel Aviv, and I'm afraid even those who are sophisticated players, even in Iran, who know how to capitalize on this. And they're making a hell of a lot of money shorting and making long bets on oil, on insurance, on shipping, things like that. So Ansarallah is not a partisan in that. And I think they're sensitive to the sometimes dubious and conflicted interest that some players may have that may come from this so-called axis of resistance, but is fragmenting very quickly, and so unfortunately. From the abandonment of Syria to the virtual now isolation of Hezbollah, they're going to have to fight it out on their own. They're not going to be able to get access to resupplies of weapons, much like Ansarallah had to survive 10 years of encirclement. Now, Ansarallah has been able to develop, in a large scale, apparently, capacity to build those missiles that are now raining down on a largely undefended Saudi infrastructure, let alone those troops who have been exposed to drone attacks now for the last couple of days, which in itself is very interesting because it's creating a new kind of tension within these circuits in southern Yemen that is, again, beyond the ability of Ansarallah to directly influence. They're very savvy. They know there is a very contentious dynamic at play in southern Yemen, which we can talk about, something that really came to the fore in late 2025, but something that I even mentioned in my book in 2018, what I called the war within the war on Yemen between rival GCC member states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So I'm bringing a lot of things, added value, if you will, to this answer in the hope that I can steer moving forward some of the follow-up. But for now, let's just keep it at that Ansarallah is not acting in some kind of cohesive form and shape, collaborating with Iran. The Revolutionary Guard faces its own domestic political problems that were manifest throughout this 6-month period, with very often contradictory messages coming from various circles, from the liberal side, if you will, of the politicians, from those hardliners who have long been at the forefront of a war against Israel, against the Americans, whether it be in Iraq, in Syria, South Lebanon, or in fields further abroad, whether it be in Argentina or elsewhere. But so Ansarallah we must consider and think about and talk about now as operating independently of Iran's own conflicted and sometimes contradictory response to what's happening in the Gulf.
Yeah, so there is a lot there, and a lot of it I have planned on asking you about, including the kind of sibling rivalry, if we can call it, in the GCC. But I did want to follow up on the siege, right? You mentioned that Yemen has now been under siege for 12 years, and it has recently announced its counter strategy with the equation siege for siege. So in response to the siege on Yemeni ports and airports, it is now targeting Saudi tankers in the Red Sea. And this is quite a powerful escalation in response to a blockade that has had profound humanitarian consequences in Yemen. And I know that you're saying that Yemen is acting independently here, but I think the context of the broader US, Israel, Iran conflagration is unavoidable. And I'm wondering, after 12 years of this siege, why does Yemen have the confidence to make this move now in terms of counter-imposing a siege on Saudiya? And what do you think it portends for MBS and Saudi Arabia, which is also contesting with the closure or partial closure of Hormuz on its other shore?
Okay, so there's two things. So firstly, as a strategy, this is something that Ansarallah used before. They've been able to deliver over 1,000 kilometers away ballistic missiles that hit assets in East Arabia. in 2019, 2020, 21, where they really were able to escalate their air campaign against both UAE and Saudi Arabia. Abu Dhabi's assets were hit as well. And that very quickly led to a negotiated ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire is not held. Saudi Arabia and UAE have regularly utilized the opportunities and their ability to command the skies to hit assets, so to speak, and to continue the siege, which, again, the UN is more than happy to continue as well, with, unfortunately, Russia and China regularly standing behind a collective UN policy. So that's already a tactic that we know captures the attention of certain actors. The problem is things have changed. Certainly, COVID in general has changed the larger world global economy. If you consider, and I can alert your audience to remind us that the so-called Arab Spring events of 2010, 2011, which in many ways started in the streets of Yemen's major cities and quickly became a way of accounting for and talking about the Middle East moving forward, right? That neatly tied in then to the use of assets to destabilize Syria with devastating consequences, very much like what happened to Libya or Iraq and Sudan and Yemen, obviously. We will see Syria as a primary target. Now, some of us willing to make the association, the connections to what's happening in the larger global theater, if you will, and tying that with what's happening in Eurasia since 2014, we're seeing a significant structural shift in how the global economy works. Certainly, the financing dynamic is with AI, with Bitcoin, with digitization. That aspect, something that really does not directly affect Yemen, and Yemenis can't really directly affect that. We know that Iranians do participate in those circuits and are actually very good at manipulating that. Yemenis don't have that capacity. They don't have the ability to generate the kind of energy that's required to play cyber warfare or profit from the business side of that. But what's happening, especially with the successful ending of the campaign in Syria, opening up and availing Syrian territory once again to pipelines, is they're going to see a dramatic transformation in how supply chains are going to be organized. Shipping, long since the 19th century, especially with steamships, the building of canals, the maintenance of canals, the strategic thinking of protecting and preserving Suez, Panama, and straits like Hormuz and Bab al-Mandab, that's very much 20th century now. I think pipelines is a very lucrative new phase, if you will, of finance capitalist imperialism moving forward. Syria allows for Gulf oil and gas to flow freely without the need of even refinement anymore. A very lucrative business on its own, right? We can think about the war on Gaza, the investment in Gaza as a zone for rebuilding. Certainly properties, Kushner and others like to build golf courses and all that. But more to the point about what's happened to the larger world and Europe in particular, as it's been shut off from Russian oil and gas, increasingly being forced to buy more expensive Gulf of Mexico or Venezuelan refined product, is that moving forward, we're going to see billions, if not trillions of dollars being generated and made by pumping oil and gas, the cheap oil and gas from the Gulf, and being refined in the East Mediterranean. What we're seeing right now is all the infrastructure that Aramco, that had been privatized in the 70s, and Mohammed bin Salman, very emphatically seeking new sources of revenue, started to initiate privatization of Saudi assets with the IPOs in the COVID period, something that I've written about in another piece regarding the GCC, as all these regimes struggle to find on the horizon how to survive the transition that's happening in the global economy. And unfortunately for the Gulf and the Middle East, long a supplier of cheap oil and gas, a source of financing where any money that did go into the Gulf by way of purchases of its oil would have to be recycled back into equity markets in the West or buying big infrastructure projects from engineering companies. Those engineering projects, the build up, if you will, of Doha, of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, their building of capacity to be self-sufficient in electricity production, seawater desalination plants, refining, that's all been destroyed now. And they're not going to have the money to rebuild it. So where are you going to get all this refinement going on moving forward? Well, it's going to be done in Tel Aviv. It's going to be done in Gaza, which has trillions of dollars worth of oil and gas now legally open for open bidding, which they're doing. Southern Lebanon, territorial disputes are going to have more or less de facto now been resolved with Israel's ethnic cleansing of South Lebanon. So Ansarallah's old strategy may actually not work anymore because in the fact, the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab, and the Straits of Hormuz may actually no longer be as strategically important. You can see this by the way of Saudi Arabia's heavy investment in trying to control Mahra province, the province that borders Omani territories with Yemen, in order to gain direct access to the Arabian Sea by way of pipeline. UAE has been trying to establish Fujairah as a point of departure for supply chain flow to avoid the Straits of Hormuz. Oman wanted to start playing in Duqom, play into this project. All that buzz about the Red Sea development from Neom to other development was all an attempt to generate investment overtures, to bring some money in from the global south, perhaps even some institutional funders in Norway or in the United States, to bring some money to Saudi Arabia, which is desperately in need of some role to play in this transitioning global economy.
It's a big vision.
It is a big vision, and we get surprised every day that we reach our target faster, and we extend that to a newer target and a bigger ambition. So it's really exciting.
Your ministers say you work them hard.
Well, you can see in 2022 we are the fastest G20 country growing, and also in this year, if you take just the non-oil GDP part, we are the second fastest in the G20 growing. So it's like a fight between Saudi Arabia and India, a good fight.
And as I mentioned many times, there's going to be maybe one survivor in the Gulf moving forward, one regime of these family-run operations. Saudi Arabia can very easily be parceled off into entities that were no longer functioning. Those areas that don't produce the raw material that's needed for the 21st century will go by way of Somalia or parts of Yemen. And unlike Yemenis, those people who are living in these future neglected regions don't have the means to actually fight for a place in whatever world awaits us. So blowing up infrastructure may in fact serve the long-term interest of outside players. I don't think people in Tel Aviv or Wall Street are really that concerned, frankly. I think they're more than happy to see very expensive infrastructure blown up. They're not interested in rebuilding it. They're going to replace that infrastructure on the eastern Mediterranean coast. This is why Turkey is important here. Because Erdogan and his son-in-law and his alliance with this oligarch, this military-industrial complex that has emerged in Turkey, will be one of those main beneficiaries, along with Israeli oligarchs and those connected with Ukraine, and most likely Russia, moving forward. The infrastructure that is being built for the Beltway initiatives that connects Iran with China now will remain serviceable for China's energy needs, perhaps even India's energy needs. But that doesn't require refinement. The oil and gas will go by way of pipeline. Building that will be very lucrative for those who command the contracts for it. And the huge financial benefits that come from controlling Europe's supply of oil and gas moving forward will be largely one that connects the Trump people, the Biden people, the Zelensky people, and Tel Aviv. Just one last point of emphasis, the pipelines that had linked the Sahel through Algeria to Spain, which was an alternative to this very corrupt, very conflicted politics around the Nord Stream and South Stream supplies chain, if you will, for European consumption of oil and gas, may be the next zone for conflict, as we see the crisis with Spanish North African territories being flooded now with young men from Morocco, alerting us to Israel's long-term strategy of completely isolating Europe and becoming more or less entirely dependent on Israeli-American assets for its energy moving forward. So blowing up tankers is good politics. It alerts us to something that worked in 2020s, early 2020s. I'm afraid Saudi Arabia, if they're dependent on that old business model, then they're stupider than I think they are. But I think they are also making the transition. They understand and read the writing on the wall and are moving to becoming players, ascendant players at the expense of Qatar and Abu Dhabi in terms of who's going to be the main beneficiary of this structural change, where infrastructure is moved to the East Mediterranean.
That's all extremely fascinating. I have one quick follow-up before I move on to the next question, which is, do you think that the pipeline strategy is more defensible against the kinds of tactics that Iran and Yemen are using because they can construct these pipelines to be impervious to missile and drone attacks? Or is it because by building out these pipelines, there's not one concentrated point of weakness, as in the Bab al-Mandab or Strait of Hormuz, where there's one choke point that can be the target of attacks? Is it more about resilience or is it more about dispersion?
Both. You can see that playing itself out in Yemen itself. Yemen's oil and gas continues to flow, with China buying up at significant price reduction the raw material, and they take it on their ships and bring it to Shanghai. And someone, a warlord who doesn't cost much, pay him $1 million a day, and he will produce you $30 million of revenue, of profits. And you can do that and replicate that with the Gulf, with the raw material flowing in pipelines, with not even an organized state anymore necessary. It's kind of like the old, caravans of the 19th century now, again. Where you can leave the vast majority of the territories to, you don't need a population where in the case of UAE, 80% is foreign workers, right?
Yeah.
If we're moving towards a model where we have 15-minute cities and we really are invested in controlling what remains of our abilities to actually think and communicate, as we see with these initiatives in the EU and certainly in the United States, China, the business model moving forward is not to make money off of selling people milk product. It's going to be to actually have an absolute monopoly on energy and water supply, and screw those who actually still need it to survive, right? I mean, You guys are in North America and you're seeing the data centers becoming a big issue because they are literally plundering the natural resources that others would need to survive as a basic middle-class lifestyle. So we're going to be expected to sacrifice our living standards. But the people of the areas that are producing the raw materials moving forward, whether it be in Congo, those poor people who are digging with their hands the cobalt, the lithium fields, that, again, we don't give a damn about the people who live in and around it anymore. There'll be plenty of oil and gas is not labor intensive anyways. You don't need that many people to actually maintain these things. If you can flow that and make a hell of a lot more money building infrastructure and then controlling the refined product closer to Europe, that's the dream that had long been the storyline, if you will, of empire since investment in Kirkuk by the British in the beginning of the 20th century. So we're back to Sykes-Picot again.
Well, I do want to go back in history, but first I want to talk about something that has also happened in the past week or so, which is the new mutual defense treaty signed in Mecca between the governments of Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, where they purportedly have agreed to come to each other's military defense in the event one is attacked.
The leaders of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan have signed a joint defence agreement. The deal comes at a time of heightened regional tensions due to the US-Iran war. It was signed by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif in Mecca. Turkey is describing it as, quote, purely defensive in nature. Pakistani Foreign Minister says under the agreement, an attack against any of the three countries will be considered an attack against them all.
But it seems like there are a lot of caveats to that. There has been some discussion over whether this is a coalition against Iran or a coalition in anticipation of some conflict with Israel, which seems extremely unlikely to me, or whether this is just a hedge against the United States security umbrella, which does not seem to be functioning, or at least as well as advertised these days. I'm wondering if, just following up on response to your last question, if you see this as an extension of the broader Turkey-Saudi alignment that you were just naming, or Saudi trying to break off from some of the other GCC states. And then B, whether you see this having any bearing on the re-escalating conflict in Yemen, right? I mean, it's a mutual defense treaty and, the next day Saudi is attacked by Ansarallah. So yeah, I'm just curious for your read on that agreement.
Well, Saudi Arabia has long relied on auxiliaries from other countries. Human resources have long supplied, especially in military and police. Historically, were Yemenis, ironically enough, until the first Gulf War of 1990-91. And since Pakistanis, Baluchis, increasingly from Sudan, young men have been availing their bodies for cannon fodder in these various regional wars. And that would, I think, be the extent to which Pakistan plays a role in all this. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not able to provide the financial foundations to any expansive realignment, if you will, in Pakistan or in Turkey. There's going to be business to be made, for sure, but that was already being done. Turkey was already supplying its Bayraktar drones and making pretty good money off of that. Turkey's fundamental role has long been to provide and secure supply chain access for Israel. There's not been one day during the horrible events in Gaza where ships from Turkey did not come and resupply Israel. So those people who still talk about these three countries or any combination of them as somehow trying to organize and gain leverage over an adversary like Israel is missing entirely the deep insinuation of these countries into the infrastructure that is empire. Mohammed bin Salman does not operate without the United States approval. He would be gone yesterday if he was doing things that were in contradiction to the primary interest of those who are stakeholders in the Wall Street, City of London matrix that runs the world, perhaps. So let's think about this public gesture as just that. It is a way of orientating how we talk about things, how people in these societies think about things. All these polities, Pakistan is very much at odds with the leadership that has come to power at the expense of Prime Minister Khan, whose image is regularly circulated, and especially in diaspora, as a victim of the old, going back to the 1980s, of this military alliance that has been forged with the CIA using political Islam to brutalize the vast majority of the peoples of Pakistan at the expense of Pakistan realizing any long-term success. I mean, it's a country that suffers regularly from misallocation of resources. Turkey, similarly, Erdogan's gang is not a popular element, an entity inside Turkish domestic politics. No matter the attempts to mobilize political Islam, the very fact that Erdogan's contradictions vis-a-vis Israel are self-evident to everyone in Turkey, the abandonment of the alliance with Qatar to fulfill the ambitions of occupying or more or less annexing large parts of Syria, perhaps with territories of Iraq at play. This is, again, a public relations move. It's a business opportunity, and it does not in any ways suggest any deviation from what was happening for the last 15 years in the region. Other than, I would suggest there's a significant potential problem domestically, both in Turkey and in Saudi Arabia, for the direction this kind of alliance alerts us to. So manpower, Pakistan continues to supply soldiers, perhaps more directly now, with behind the rationale that there is an alliance, with the financing coming by way of new bonds or new issues of IPOs. I don't know. Saudi Arabia's economy has been a fire sale for a while now, and abandoning any kinds of reference to Salafist type of morality politics that had been in place since the 1960s. And Turkey is clearly made the adjustments where it no longer needs to cater to the Muslim Brotherhood's fanatics that it mobilized to wage war in Syria and on Yemen. The Yemen portfolio has changed. The rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia is the primary engine for the violence in southern Yemen, which we may come back to if you wish. So that could also be some way of explaining what will be the results of this public display of what had already been, in terms of structurally and materially, already at play for many, many years.
So yes, I would like to get into the competition between the Saudis and the Emiratis in Yemen, because I think that is a very important way to understand the crisis that we're seeing today. For many years, the Emiratis have sought to control southern Yemen and its ports as a part of their broader networked approach to regional power, in recent years backing the separatist STC. And since the downfall of the Saleh government during the so-called Arab Spring, this has come into direct conflict with the Saudis, who have backed the so-called internationally recognized government. Can you just tell us a bit for our audience how this power struggle has played out in Yemen? And then also, how have different actors within Yemen navigated that power struggle and perhaps pit different forces against each other, taking advantage of this competitive environment for their own interests?
I want to add always Qatar to this setup. It's very conveniently, not an accusation towards you, but more generally in this scholarship, conveniently Qatar is left out in many of these discussions about the rivalry between Gulf states in Yemen. Because the primary beneficiary during the Arab Spring in many countries, whether it be Libya or Syria and Yemen, were in fact the Qatari-Turkish alliance. And that originates from the Clintons. The heavy investment in political Islam, at least in the form of the Brotherhood, I'd say, assets that had been emerging since the 1970s, largely deemed to be hostile to Saudi Arabia and their brand of takfirism, much more, let's say, liberal, especially in economic terms, a liberal capitalist, kind of venture capitalist, small-term investor, property owners, advocates for using capital to develop small-scale economic activity is the portfolio of the Muslim Brotherhood, and something that Turkey also benefited. Uplifting the otherwise abandoned urban and rural poor, making them into active economic actors as well as participants in the politicization of life. So Qatar and Turkey were very successful in partnership with the Clintons in the 1990s to mobilize this phenomena at the expense of more traditional alliances that the Bushes and the oil industries had created and forged with Saudi Arabia and perhaps even the UAE. UAE is the most emphatically hostile entity towards this Muslim Brotherhood phenomena because they saw within their own inner circles a lot of personalities embracing this esprit, if you will, that conjoined entrepreneurialism and liberalism. And that fundamentally threatens the ruling family in Abu Dhabi and to a lesser extent, Dubai. And so we see this playing itself out in the relationship that these three states had with the outside world. And that included places for opportunities for expanding and strategically expanding economic influence and therefore political influence. Qatar and UAE have sought to gain a foothold in what had long been deemed Saudi sphere of influence in Yemen. And that goes back to already when Saudis are annexing large parts of the northwest of Yemen, which today is the southwest of Saudi territories. And the beneficiaries in the 1990s and 2000s, especially of the circulation of cocaine money, of heroin money, and new forms of financing was the UAE. And they were able to parlay that circulation of capital into direct investments via Dubai Ports World. They were able to acquire, through corruption and other means, access to dilapidated infrastructure in parts of Yemen, Somalia, Eritrea, and become big players that threatened, especially Saudi Arabia's long-term assumed role and the real political capacities that Qatari Turkish interest had in places like Yemen, who, again, because of the Clintons and therefore the Obama administration, through their embassy, their State Department, and in the case of Yemen, the role of the U.S. Embassy was crucial to seeing the end of the Saleh regime be less violent than could have potentially gone, less revolutionary, and one that basically was handed to assets of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islah Party. And for a while, the Saudis were browbeaten to accept this and become minor allies, if you will, in this process, with the UAE becoming very, very frustrated by losing with the 2012 interim government initiating partnerships and ending earlier contracts. Dubai Ports World loses its access to the mines of Yemen, which are very lucrative, to the ports, and new bidding wars begin, which Qatari and Saudis would become the major winners in the process, primarily Qatari. So this initiates a more aggressive investment in the politics of southern Yemen. Yemen has a long history with the attachment with the British Empire, with many of those polities, or emirates, if you want to call it that, ruling families that worked in partnership with the British in South Yemen. When they lose South Yemen to revolution in the 1960s, late 1960s, many of them end up in the trucial states of what was still the British Empire's kind of larger Middle East investment. And they intermarried with families in what becomes the UAE. So the UAE becomes, at the personal level, by way of mothers to these elites in these smaller emirates, as well as in Abu Dhabi. They see themselves as Yemenis, or at least southern Yemenis. And so this initiates this investment in Iraq that eventually becomes in 2017 what you referenced as the Southern Transitional Council, wanting to break away from this Qatari-managed interim state that is now exiled from Yemen because of Ansarallah's mobilization, this outrage to how the American embassy was managing the transition from revolution to much more acceptable disaggregation. They were proposing a federation of Yemen to basically put all the natural resources, all the wealth in a largely unpopulated, massive region, which becomes more or less South Yemen, with the lion's share of the population living in poverty and in resource-poor other federated zones. So that was the model moving forward, which Ansarallah said, no, you're going to have to, we're going to go back to elections, we're going to go back to a constitutional mechanism that sees Yemenis benefit from the natural resources of Yemen. And so the investment by these three competing entities is for control of Yemen's resources. And we must highlight the larger global context, financial crisis from 2008 to the upcoming financial crisis that plays itself out first in equity markets and the cost of borrowing money, which all Gulf countries do regularly. They don't produce enough revenues to actually sustain their economies by way of sales of oil. Oil is regularly being pumped out of these countries at a loss. So they borrow money. They borrow tons of money, and regularly inflections in rates leads to financial, very, very dangerous moments for these regimes. They increasingly have to make new kinds of long-term strategy adjustments, which in the case of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are overseas operations. So the war in Sudan, the war in Libya, the fighting over their resources are all about the sustainability of these regimes moving forward, which is more than something that's acceptable for Israel, for the United States, and the big players at Wall Street, because this is just a very lucrative, again, strategic and structural transformation of the global economy. And Yemenis themselves are, unfortunately, the human resources for these militias that are going to emerge. They are going to be armed. And you don't have a salary because the government doesn't function anymore. There is no central bank. The resources that are coming through the state coffers are controlled by Riyadh or by Abu Dhabi, or by extension, the Americans are the ones actually managing all these assets and profiteering from those who are buying on the cheap, whether it be India or China. They're buying at significant reductions of market prices of Yemeni raw materials. So if you want to survive in Yemen, you have to get armed and you have to make yourself available to this infrastructure of conflict over assets, over leverage moving forward. There is no economic activity in southern Yemen since 2015 that does not directly attend to the sustaining of military capacities of these rival Gulf countries. There is no factory work. There is no vibrant economy. There is no agriculture per se. This is a region that is a net exporter of raw materials, with any money that comes from the sales of this raw materials going abroad. And those who are expected to maintain this plundering of Yemen are given small salaries, literally $100 a month to feed the family. They have a weapon. If they're lucky, they get recruited into an officer kind of position. But they're the ones who are going to be suffering throughout this period. And of course, we have talking about northern Yemen, where the vast majority of people live under siege. There were periods of starvation, especially in the earlier periods of the war of 2015, 2018, really ugly scenes of war of attrition. Within the first couple of weeks of bombardment, they attacked food infrastructure, they attacked bridges, roads, tried to incapacitate the ability of Yemenis to move, to feed each other, feed themselves. A country that, by way of Ali Abdullah Saleh's very corrupt regime, transformed a self-sufficient agricultural-based economy to one that produced large amounts of mangoes for the regional markets and imported 90% of food. An economic development model that has been adopted throughout the world with devastating consequences for the local populations. So, fortunately for Yemenis, in the north, Ansarallah, despite having to wage war and defend itself, they have been able to mobilize the skills of hardworking Yemeni farmers. And so North Yemen is now able to at least survive on the self-sufficiency in food production once again, which may be, unfortunately, also one of the first things that are going to be targeted moving forward is being under siege. They have access through Hodeidah, but no ship comes into Hodeidah without first being processed by the Americans who are maintaining the blockade. And we know from reports that much of the medicines are outdated and are dangerous and have to be destroyed once they arrive in Hodeidah. We know that the grains that are being paid for these corrupt mechanisms that produce grains in Nebraska come inedible by the time they reach the port of Hodeidah. So Yemenis in the north have had to learn how to feed themselves and are living under siege all this time. And unfortunately for the people of the south, despite the fact that there's a back and forth of who actually controls the lion's share of the most productive assets of southern Yemen, they see no results. Aden, the big city of the south, has open sewage, has rarely any reliable electricity. It's a place where you see huge spikes in food prices as supplies get regularly depleted. And they face endless violence. Aden, last couple of days, have seen bombs in certain neighborhoods. So there's clearly now people taking advantage of this Ansarallah's latest initiation of conflict to settle scores, to perhaps even just collect as much as they can. So hoarding. So you saw this bases in Marib being plundered by the population, stolen weapons, things like that. But they're also going after food stores. They're also looking for ways to survive what comes next, which is a new war within this larger war against Ansarallah. Phew, that's a long answer. Sorry.
No, I mean, I really appreciate all that context. And I think I would like to go a little bit even deeper on the territorial aspect of this, especially in North Yemen. And just by way of kind of demystifying some of the narratives that we hear in the West around Ansarallah, right? Because since 2015, Ansarallah has been portrayed in Western media as a proxy force of Iran. We have done already a lot to deconstruct that narrative. But broadly speaking, that was the story we heard about why Saudi had to go and do like Cold War style containment, and the United States had to support Saudi in that effort.
Under Operation Decisive Storm, the objective was to eliminate the threat that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia faced in the form of ballistic missiles, heavy weapons, and an air force that were controlled by a militia that is radical, that is allied to Iran and Hezbollah. That was the objective. So we destroyed their air force, we destroyed their ballistic missiles, as far as we know. We destroyed their command and control. We destroyed much, if not most, of their heavy equipment, and we made it very difficult for them to move from a strategic perspective. So we've degraded their capabilities substantially and thereby eliminated the threat that they posed to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and in the process ensured the safety of our borders, our territory, and our citizens.
In your book, you detail how you detail the history of Ansarallah and how it is a very organic mobilization and formation within Yemeni society. But you also locate its origins in a territorial concession made by the Saleh government to Saudiya in 2000, and how it upset a equilibrium that had roughly been in place since the 1930s. Can you talk a little bit about that, the impact of that territorial concession on Yemeni agricultural production and how it has continued to foster the Ansarallah resistance?
Historically, Yemeni has been really an amalgamation of virtually independent zones, if you will, of economic activity. Topographically, it's a very different country. It's a very difficult country to navigate in the north, especially with its mountains. I mean, quite stunning terrain with quite remarkable techniques of agriculture in some of the more difficult conditions. That was, again, sustainable at the local level. These was never going to be a centralized kind of economic managed, technocratically managed from Sana'a through a Ministry of Agriculture or something, which is regularly what Yemen had to face over the course of especially since the end of the Imamate of 1962, with Egypt initiating this process and then UN and the Americans moving forward, trying to rationalize a Yemeni national economy, where in fact self-reliance was at a regional, local level was the logical way for millennia. And with the arrival of territorialization, with the support of the expansion of Ibn Saud's enterprise, first by way of British financing and weapons, and then later in collaboration with the Americans, at the expense of the Hijaz, which was long ruled by it's a very distinctive constituency. And for the what previously mentioned region of Asir, the southwest of what today is Saudi Arabia, was historically, topographically, economically connected with larger Yemen. And that's one of the only areas, if you actually look at the maps that demonstrate this, that has sustainable cultivation of food possible, with regular access to water that comes from the monsoon seasons that periodically pass through. I mean, currently it's raining in Yemen right now in those areas, which makes for an interesting side note in terms of how war is going to be fought for the next couple of weeks and months. But this is a long-term strategy that Charles Crane and Twitchell, who eventually helps establish the Aramco enterprise, the state private oil company of what eventually becomes known as Saudi Arabia, they're managing and overseeing a territorial expansion of the Saud state to eventually what it becomes recognized as a kingdom. And it does so at the expense of, like I mentioned before, communities in the west as well as in the east, in the other agricultural productive areas like Hassa, which happened to be later on where all the oil is. But originally, what was targeted was food, the capacity to produce food, not for domestic consumption per se, because the populations were relatively small, but more importantly for export. So that was the working model for Saudi Arabia in the 1930s and 1940s, was to commandeer what was available in terms of productive land and use that as a starting point for a national or kingdom economy, which was, again, very much engineered by American expertise by the late 30s, early 40s. And so the wars that were waged in the early 30s at the expense of Imam Yahya and the Yemeni polities that had worked with Imam Yahya, the ending of a dynasty under Idrisi of this area in the 1920s that had formally forged alliances with the Italians in Eritrea, with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union forges an alliance with Imam Yahya. All of this is playing into new calculations about the valuation of your land, of nature, of natural resources like water. And despite the fact that Imam Yahya could not parlay enough collective support to push back this expansionism of Saudi Arabia, they were able, however, to leverage a concession that these are territories that would be rented out, if you will. And these are kinds of agreements that you can find in many parts of the world. And this would be basically areas that would service this economic activity that the Saudi kingdom would need. So food, water. The peoples in the region would be protected from persecution, and they were largely Ismaili Zaydis at the time. And indeed, we don't see massive migrations of Sunni Takfiri types until the 50s and 60s in the region, into this region. So it remains culturally still Yemeni. And the boundaries, with the exception of a very small area from the coastline into the hinterland, maybe some 70 kilometers, the rest of that vast territory is between Yemen, first Imam Yahya's Yemen, and then British South Yemen, was unmarked. And the peoples who lived and had historically utilized these lands were, by treaty, allowed to move back and forth. And as the Saudi economy increasingly becomes one oriented towards production of oil and utilizing its ability to borrow money to build cities, and becomes this kind of quintessential rentier state that imports labor, largely from Yemen, initially at least, and increasingly doesn't need the agricultural aspects of the Asyad region, but needs it for other reasons, becomes a point of contention periodically with Yemenis who make their regular claims that the renewing of this agreement, which is over periods of 30 years, the next time we come up with the deadline, we're going to renegotiate this. One, you're going to make sure that people still have access to move back and forth, despite the fact that this becomes a wonderful conduit for not only cheap labor coming from Africa, but also for weapons, for drugs, for all kinds of things that are consumed by this globalization, if you will, of the Arabian Peninsula, larger Arabian Peninsula. Yemen is this important conduit. Now, the attempt to try to somehow regulate that and to commandeer the economic productivity of that region becomes increasingly a point of tension. And this is where you start to see Saudi Arabia investing in changing the profile of who lives there. So more and more settlers come in from other parts of Saudi Arabia, or converted Pakistani, South Asian Takfiri types who then increasingly dominate the economic activity if the cities of the countryside becomes a zone for tourism, which annoys to no end the indigenous population, who are not well treated in larger Saudi context, who are still treated with scorn, hostility, and mistrust because of their underlying Yemeni orientation. And so by 2000, with the weakness of Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime, or willingness to capitulate, with the pressure to actually securitize and delineate boundaries, in large part in order to assure that oil contracting moving forward would actually make sense. Lawyers representing oil companies don't like precarity, so they wanted to see something defined before they allowed their companies to actually sign on the dotted line. And unfortunately, Saleh did not have much leverage in this point and conceded significant territories and allowing for this previous agreement to be ripped apart and a line drawn. And the Saudis, just like the UAE would do with Oman, around Buremi and other areas of economic activity, they would start to erect a wall, so to speak, that would stop historic commercial activity of the peoples of the region, which for Yemenis, on the Yemeni side, dramatic adjustments would have to be made. And they were not going to be serviced by the government in Sana'a. Indeed, they would be reprimanded for voicing their concerns about the long-term consequences of not having access to seasonal water wells for their livestock, to not having legal access to the markets, which were often quite lucrative for them, and shutting down of smuggling or the creation of new demands for smuggling completely changes the profile of the economic activity of people in northern Yemen. And increasingly, the Americans and others put pressure on Sana'a to help enforce the boundaries, which leads to suppression, which then mobilized politically as well as collectively self-defense forces that could not be suppressed by way of introducing takfiris, which Saleh oversaw also, allowing for academies to emerge in the heartlands of these peoples of the north, also antagonized people to the point where they actually gravitated towards using weapons to make their demands that were otherwise not considered in Sana'a or in the American embassy or Riyadh for that matter. So we're talking about the attempts to impose economic and therefore social relations on people who has historically were operating in very different terms. And as the central state tries to command control over economic activity and who settles where and how people do their business, people responded with guns. I was in that area in 1993, and I remember very well. It was Sada was a notorious area for an open air market for military weapons. And I could have, if I wanted to, buy an anti-aircraft, 50 millimeter shells with these double pumpers. That was on sale there. So 1993 was a very different place. And Saleh and the Americans were expecting to see a change of that relationship between the people who were well-armed and economically independent, self-sufficient, that had to be integrated into the global economy. And if it took violent terms where the state would send its military to suppress any resistance to that, so be it. It was a disaster for Yemen, but it helped initiate this process of organization of armed resistance that would spawn Ansarallah.
I think that brings us to where I would like to close out, because that what you just named, I think, is a major current through your work, which is a reframing of the narrative of Yemen as a state perpetually in civil conflict into a broader story about a global effort to corral Yemen into the world system of global capitalism, both through the carrot of aid and NGOification, et cetera, and the stick of destruction and disintegration. And then also the story of Yemen's resistance to those efforts. And I'm wondering, what is your view of Yemen's future from the position of the present? We are in a period of cascading crises for the world system, potentially a terminal crisis, if not of capitalism, then of liberalism as a global order and United States global hegemony. What is the future for Yemen? Can Yemen continue to resist integration? How can Yemen relate to the emerging world orders, some of which we've been describing in terms of, for example, the activities of certain Gulf states, the Emiratis seeking to build an anti-sovereigntist regime throughout Africa in terms of resource accumulation, etc., perhaps a more multipolar world. How can Yemen continue to resist the forces of empire looking forward?
Well, what we mean by Yemen today is not that unified entity that emerged in 1990-91. We are going to deal with territories that are disaggregated from the unified Yemeni state. There is not going to be a project, maybe with some territories being integrated into Ansarallah's administration, but I'm afraid whether or not the people of STC are going to realize what they ultimately hoped for, or we'll see Saudi expansion into Mahar lead to a de facto annexation, if not outright annexation of that territory. At best, we're going to see Ansarallah's administration, our administered areas, remain isolated. They are not, unfortunately for the rest of the world, they're not going to be able to project their ability and their sensibility, their values, their moral and ethical approach to understanding how the world works and export it. They're not going to be revolutionaries who are going to come and save the day in Latin America or in the cities of North America. So they're on their own and we are on our own. Moving forward, you're going to see a lot of turmoil in the larger Arabian Peninsula. As I suggested, you're not going to see three ruling families emerge over the short term from the Gulf. The way moving forward seems increasingly the way of Sudan, of Somalia, of Yemen, of Libya, of Syria. Areas that are loosely governed, controlled by relatively cheap armed men who have to deal with the local consequences of their actions, but in the end don't have any major global consequence. The flow of natural resources are going to continue, as we see in Central Africa, with infrastructure being built to avail that raw material, but the living standards of the peoples who are living in the poisonous environment that is resulting from the production of that stuff, they can go to hell. They are living in hell. More and more of our brothers and sisters in the world are living in hell. And unfortunately in Yemen, those areas that are not in the direct administrative zone of the Ansarallah are by and large living in hell right now. It's a horrible sets of conditions that they're living in southern Yemen. It's not a pleasant place for most people. In northern Yemen, they may be able to survive if they could somehow get some relief from this constant pressure from wars and bombardment. It's a remarkable moment of resilience that perhaps the conditions themselves demand of people to make the extra effort to be something extraordinary as they are. But right now, in face of siege, of war on them, those in northern Yemen will survive, but in isolation. That's the best we could hope for them. And I'm sorry to say again, they're not going to come in and swoop in and save the rest of the world from what awaits us. It is a controlled demolition. It is the destruction of our experience of moderate material comfort in the West. The subsidies that we got from the global South will now be almost entirely gobbled up by 0.0001% of the population. And we can go to hell too. And that's what we're seeing. We're going to see more of us encouraged to hate each other, much like people in Yemen hate each other, until it becomes a window of opportunity where Ansarallah makes overtures to them and maybe they start to reconsider what they were programmed to talk and think about their relationship with neighbors. So if anything we can learn from Yemen is the resilience that is possible if we collectively work together. Kind of like, going back to the 19th century, for goodness sake. Let's model how we move forward on how Ansarallah and the peoples of northern Yemen have survived this campaign of destruction. Unfortunately, larger Yemen is no longer a project moving forward. So that's, I think, somewhat of an answer to your question. But the destructive forces that brought destruction and ruin to Yemen are at play right now in the larger region, in North America, in Europe itself. And it's not by mistake that Europeans have been killing each other for the last 300 years, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. We may end up having events in Ukraine playing itself out elsewhere, whether it be in the Balkans, my homeland, or elsewhere, whether it be South Spain. What awaits us, I don't know, but it behooves us to learn a little bit of how Ansarallah put together and survived the tools of disaggregation, of destruction, which included sectarianism, it included classism, included racism, and they survived all that. And they have survived even with actually projecting a principled response to genocide elsewhere, which is, again, it's far better than what we've done in the United States or Europe, as far as I'm concerned.
All right, Professor Blumi, I, for one, would not like to go to hell. And so I will take your lesson in the most positive light possible, which is to emphasize the principles of resilience, level-headedness, clear-eyedness, and resistance. And I believe the political project before us is to build those bonds, build those forces capable of survival and resistance for the long term. We really, really appreciate your analysis and your work. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.